So in this video, I want to touch on training while bulking. Is it different when you're cutting? Is it different when you're bulking? Kind of what to expect when you enter a bulking phase with all things training. So first things first, what are the differences between training when you're bulking versus training when you're not? And the biggest difference is obviously your level of growth, muscle-wise as well as strength, is significantly faster when you have enough resources, aka calorie surplus, bulking phase, versus when you don't in a calorie deficit. So that's kind of the biggest thing. You're able to, one, get much better pumps in the gym. You have more glycogen, you have more salt from your diet, which you'll really feel in the gym. So you're gonna have more energy and you're gonna have more better pumps first and foremost. Second is you're able to obviously increase strength. So your rate of PRs, personal records, is gonna be much more frequently, right? Maybe every week you're able to add on 2 pounds to the bench press, versus if you're in a calorie deficit, it's much harder to do so, or it's at least much slower to do so. So that's another thing, is you're able to get new PRs much more frequently. And as a result, obviously, you're getting stronger over the course of the bulk and gaining more muscle, new lean tissue. So those are kind of the biggest things first and foremost of training when bulking versus training when cutting. Now, one of the biggest questions I get from people is how to train properly in order to optimize and maximize muscle growth, especially in a bulking phase when you have the resources, the excess energy to do so, right? So the biggest thing, the hands down, the most important thing when it comes to training and progressing on a week-to-week basis is focusing on progressive overload. Progressive overload. What does progressive overload mean? It simply means doing more in some sort of fashion than you did the previous time, right? Pretty easy. So there are several forms of progressive overload. Obviously, the most basic and the one that you probably know is increasing weight. You don't have to necessarily increase the weight. Let's say you're doing bench press. You don't have to increase the weight on the bench press every single week. So for some people, it's hard on their joints. And obviously, after a certain point, you kind of max out on the weight you can do, even just genetically. So weight obviously is kind of first and foremost, the most basic one to apply progressive overload with. Some of the other factors though that you might not be aware of is probably the second most basic, is volume. Just doing more sets and reps than the previous week. So let's say you did 3 sets of 10 reps on week 1. Maybe on week 2, you aim for 11 reps. Very small increase, but an increase nonetheless, and your body still has to adapt, and obviously you're still getting stronger on a week-to-week basis. So that is the second thing. Number 1 is weight, number 2 is volume. Number 3 is frequency. How often are you hitting that muscle? Let's say again, with the chest. It is more than likely when you first start working out, you're gonna be sore as hell and you're gonna be literally sore for like a week. So then it wouldn't make sense to keep training while you are sore. So obviously your frequency will be once a week. As you adapt, as you get accustomed to that training stimulus, you won't be as sore, right? Typically in the first month is kind of when you're the most sore. After that, your body adapts and it'll take maybe a day, 2 days, tops 3 days to overcome that soreness from that training session. So once you're at that point, you can start to increase the frequency of how often you're hitting that muscle group. I recommend 2 to 3 times to maximize and optimally grow that muscle. So any lagging or weaker muscles that I have, I hit them 3 times per week. So again, increasing that frequency from maybe once to 3 times. Another way to apply progressive overload to your training is reducing the rest times between your sets. If you're able to maintain the weight that you're doing with the same amount of volume, that's reps and sets, but you're shortening the rest times, that is also a sign that you are getting stronger because your body doesn't need as much rest time to do the same amount of weight and volume, which is awesome, right? So that's another thing you can focus on, is shortening your rest times from a week-to-week basis. So maybe you take a minute and a half between your bench sets. Maybe next time aim for a minute 15. Again, so that is another form of progressive overload that you can apply. Another one is your form. This one's a little bit trickier to assess, but the better, obviously, the more control you have over the movement, especially the eccentric portion. So again, with the bench press, the way, how slow and how control you lower the weight to your chest is your eccentric part. So eccentric on the way down, concentric on the way up. But the slower and more control you can do on the way down, obviously the harder it is to move that weight. So let's say on week 1 you kind of go really fast, pump it out, but then on week 3, 4 you're able to go slow and then go fast, slow on the eccentric. Then you've obviously improved your form and time under tension, right? So that is probably the most difficult one to assess, but again, you can definitely apply that if you don't feel like increasing volume or shortening your rest times or increasing the weight. Maybe you want to increase how good your form is, because that definitely translates into another level of progressive overload that you can apply to your training. Now, another question I get quite frequently is how many reps should I be doing? How many sets should I be doing? And this really, again, kind of comes down to your individual goals. Some people want to build as much muscle as possible, and some people want to get as strong as possible. Those are two entirely different goals, and subsequently two entirely different training regimens. So my recommendation, if you are someone that wants to build strength first and foremost, the best way to do so is focusing on the lower rep ranges. So typically on the rep spectrum, 1 to 5 is more strength training. 6 to about 15 is hypertrophy, so building muscle, and then 15 plus would be more muscle endurance. So again, it really depends on your specific goals. If you're someone that wants to build muscle like me, I have most of my sets between 6 reps and 15 reps. Very rarely do I do strength training 3x3 or 5x5, or do 25 reps for muscle endurance. Most, I would say 90% of my training specifically, because my goal is to build muscle, is within that 6 to 15 rep range. Again, you may have different goals. If your goal is strength, to build as much strength as possible, I'd recommend focusing more on the lower end, because you can push a lot more weight, obviously, if you're doing less reps. So there's stuff like 5x5s or 3x3s are a great way to increase your strength on a week-to-week basis. And then on the other side of the spectrum, muscle endurance, focusing on stuff way beyond 15 reps, which I personally don't do either. But I do definitely incorporate both sides of the spectrum, because doing some sort of strength training from time to time, and some sort of muscle endurance training from time to time will help me with the hypertrophy goal that I have, because if I'm able to do more reps or get stronger, obviously I'm able to do the combination of both, which is hypertrophy, with my style of training. Now, the thing that I preach the most by far is form over weights. Form over weight is absolutely probably the staple, the cornerstone of my training philosophy, because with me, my goal is to build as much muscle as I can. I'm not a power lifter, and so I don't have the same sort of style and philosophies to training as a power lifter would, obviously. So with me, form is paramount. Form is the most important thing when it comes to training if your goal is to build more muscle, right? The reason is because when you are training to build muscle, you want to target that muscle and put as much tension on that muscle as you possibly can. If you're using, let's say the bench press again, if you're using your entire body to jerk up the weight, then you're using your shoulders, your triceps, you're basically whole upper body to move that weight, versus reducing the weight and basically just isolating your chest. So you're just putting the tension on your chest, where obviously that's kind of the muscle that you want to grow, right? So that's the biggest thing with my style of training, is form over tension. If your goal is to build muscle, obviously if your goal is to build strength, it's a little bit different, because you're going to be using a lot more muscle groups to move that weight. Because obviously your goal is to move as much weight as possible, and if you're able to use more muscles, then obviously that goal becomes a lot easier. And the final thing I want to touch on in this video is how to train when you are in a calorie surplus or a bulking phase to maximize or optimize your muscle building capabilities and strength. So I learned this the hard way, but my recommendation is to train 2 to 3 muscle groups per session, right? What I did, and I wish I didn't do this when I started my journey, is I would smash out, hammer 1 muscle group per day. So for example, I would do chest Mondays, back Tuesdays, shoulders Wednesdays, arms Thursdays, so on and so forth. And just by increasing the frequency, like we touched on earlier, that is a form of progressive overload, and you're giving more stimulus to your muscles more frequently to grow much faster. So I suggest 2 to 3 muscle groups per session versus just going hard on one, because especially if you're newer, you don't need crazy volume per muscle. You don't need to do 5, 6, 7 exercises for your chest if you're a new trainee. It is much much more efficient for your time as well to hit multiple muscles per session because you will yield way more growth across multiple muscles versus hammering down one muscle and being sore for the rest of the week and not being able to train that muscle until the next week, right? So that is my biggest recommendation. Also, you don't need to go every single day, especially again, if you're a newer trainee. You can make so much progress by doing, let's say, full body 3 times per week. Just by that split alone, I wish I knew this again as well, just by that split alone, you can make tons of progress. Only increase the volume / frequency once you plateaued. But honestly, if you have less than 1-2 years of experience, you can make tons of progress by doing splits like that, where you're just, let's say in the gym, 3 full body sessions per week, or even upper lower 4 times per week, right? Those are great splits, and you can make so much progress with those splits. If you are someone that's new, you don't need to go every single day, and it's actually overkill, and it can actually regress your progress. You'll actually regress by doing too much too fast, right? If you're doing too much volume, you're going to the gym every single day, recovery is very, very crucial to progress. That's where the actual muscle building occurs. And so obviously if you're newer, it takes longer to recover because your body isn't adapted to that stimulus. So again, start off with 3-4 times per week and then only progress once you've plateaued. But honestly, if you have less than 1 to 2 years of experience, that's really all you need. So again, my favorite split that I'm doing right now and that I've done the last several years is some sort of variation of a push-pull leg split. So push being chest, shoulders, triceps, pull being back, biceps, rear delts, traps, and then legs, obviously my lower body, and then I'll also do abs on my leg days as well. So any kind of variation of that is my personal favorite. Most of my clients do that, and I've seen the most amount of progress and muscle growth from that split. Right, the first couple of years I would only do kind of a bro split, or I just do chest Mondays, back Tuesdays, like I mentioned. And as soon as I switched over to a higher frequency split, like a push-pull leg, my progress literally took off. I saw much more strength gains, as well as obviously just getting bigger and looking better as well. So that is my recommendation with how to train. Prioritize frequency over volume and split your volume across several sessions throughout the week to optimize and maximize your muscle building potential.